We're delighted to welcome Professor Jason Hall Spencer today. Professor Hall Spencer is currently working as a professor of marine biology at the University of Plymouth. He is working towards the betterment of ocean health and is a part of UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. He has completed his BSc in marine biology from Heriot-Watt University, Edinburgh, and PhD from the University of London. His current research covers seamount ecology, fisheries, ocean acidification, aquaculture, and conservation. He is also the recipient of numerous awards like the British Association Charles Lyell Award, Honorary Lecturer, University of Glasgow, University of Plymouth World Class Researcher Award, and more. Additionally, he is the president of the British Ecological Society, UK Government Scientific Advisor on Marine Conservation, and the IPCC Reviewer, Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate 2019. Professor Spencer is here with us today to deliver a fascinating webinar on the effects of ocean acidification and warming in Asia. Also, after the webinar, we'll be having a Q&A space at the end, and any doubts during the webinar can be asked in the chat box, which can be taken towards the end of the chat, to end of the webinar. We would like to welcome Professor Spencer, and I would like to hand over the space to Professor Spencer. Quick side note before I hand over the mic to Professor Spencer. If you've read the book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, you know that she interviewed Professor Spencer, and we also discussed the book at length in one of our book discussions. Welcome, Professor Spencer. I hand over the mic to you now.
Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you all. First up, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that this is work that was carried out with Sylvain Augustini. He's a French guy, but he lives in Japan. Ben Harvey, who's a graduate from Plymouth University, but also lives in Japan. Kazuo Inaba, who was the director of this marine biology place called Shimoda Marine Research Center at the University of Tsukuba. Marco Malazzo, a long-term friend of mine who studies ocean life around Sicily in Italy. And then Shigeki Wada, who is another one of these junior professors at the Shimoda Marine Center. And he's an expert on algae and biogeochemistry. So I've got this research position that means I'm a full professor both at the University of Plymouth and at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. So I'd like to teach you a little bit about what we've been doing there. Yeah, I wanted to show you this slide because it illustrates the fact that there's mass coral bleaching happening because of global warming. And very unfortunately, 70% of the biggest coral reef in Japan died in 2016, and that's due to carbon dioxide emissions. Now, this series of graphs shows you what's happening to planet Earth, the only planet that we know is inhabitable by human life in the whole universe, okay? So it's important that we take stock of what's happening here. Now, you all know, I'm sure, that carbon dioxide levels have gone up since the Industrial Revolution, way up, and they've accelerated in the rate at which they're being emitted. Even in 2020, in this global lockdown due to COVID-19, we've still seen a 2 parts per million rise in carbon dioxide levels. So it's going up and up inexorably. At the same time, other warming gases like methane in the atmosphere have been accelerating in their emissions. The amount of ozone, the size of the ozone hole in the atmosphere well, a big hole has been knocked in it since the 1950s, although that problem has plateaued and is being dealt with. The surface temperature of the Earth is increasing. The acidity of the ocean is increasing. Our ability to capture fish increased rapidly after the 1950s, but now has leveled off. And then in order to feed what is almost 8 billion people on the planet, now we're using aquaculture as well as wild-caught capture fisheries to fill that gap. So this is accelerated since the 1950s. And also, in order to feed the growing human population, we put nitrates and phosphates on the land to grow rice and other crops. And that excess nutrients ends up going into the sea. So the flux of nitrogen into the coastal zone since the 1950s has accelerated rapidly. So this shows you overall the major impact that growing population is having on the planet and our mismanagement of the planet is causing loss of marine biodiversity. Now, the one I want to focus on here is emissions of carbon dioxide. And just to put it in context, we're emitting about 10 billion tons of carbon per year into the atmosphere. Almost all of that comes from burning fossil fuels like coal, gas and oil. But some of it comes from chopping down rainforests in places like Borneo, India and Brazil. Now, of that 10 billion tons of carbon, about 50% of it ends up in the atmosphere, a quarter of it ends up in vegetation, and a quarter of it ends up in the ocean. So this number down here is 24 million tons of carbon dioxide every day is going to the ocean because of the rate at which we're burning fossil fuels. And that's equivalent to the weight of a bowling ball. Okay, if you go bowling, the weight of that ball is quite heavy. It's the equivalent of the weight of a bowling ball per person per day being thrown into the ocean. Okay, so that's a lot of carbon. And if you were to load up a train and fill it with coal, then you'd be able to wrap that train around the Earth 75 times as the equivalent of the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere every year. And if you put all this together, it leads to some concerning facts. So I'm very, very glad to be able to speak to you guys, because I guess you're going to be the stewards of the planet and advisors to your governments as you go forwards. And I think very importantly, some of you will be advisors to multinational companies as well. And it's these multinational companies that really have the power to deal with these global problems rather than individual governments like the Indian government or the UK government. It's actually some of these multinationals have got so big and so powerful that it's them that need to address this issue. So a mixture of bad management, as in things like, I don't know, putting concrete along coastal defences to stop the sea flooding towns, actually causes biodiversity loss on the coast. Pollutants, typically in places like in India or Malaysia, pollutants include sewage, raw sewage, untreated sewage from people going into the sea, which causes biodiversity loss. And then you've got all of these 4 things that relate to carbon dioxide emissions. The first one, oxygen loss, is caused by the fact that when you warm up fluids, that drives off the gases that are contained in the fluids. So if you warm up seawater, that dries off the oxygen that's in the seawater. And in the Bay of Bengal, this is a very, very serious problem, because the Bay of Bengal is right on the edge of becoming uninhabitable by organisms that need oxygen in the water. And clearly that's important for the people of Bangladesh and India. You've got the warming, which I mentioned is killing coral reefs worldwide due to mass coral bleaching. You've got acidification, which is the main focus of this talk. And then on top of all that, you've got sea level rise, because as the polar ice sheets are melting, that's causing half of the sea level rise, and thermal expansion due to warming is causing the other half. And if you combine all these things together, that equates to an ocean of stress, okay? And what I argue to you guys is that we need some scientists to address the benefits of commitments to, for example, on Convention on Biodiversity, the Paris Agreement, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Because up until now, most scientists have been focused on the problems that these aspects cause. But I think if we focus on the solutions and the benefits to humankind of adhering to these commitments, then that would be more powerful a way of persuading people to do this. So, for example, in the UK, we are pretty convinced that by leading in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, people will have jobs and make money from developing the solutions to this problem. I'm sure the same is true in India. There's that reference to the paper I mentioned in Nature Climate Change, which is basically saying that if you reduce the complexity of habitats by the corrosive effects of carbon dioxide, then that reduction in complexity has knock-on effects for the other life that lives on the seabed. So as you lose the diversity of corals, you lose the diversity of fish and invertebrates. So that's what this graph on the left is saying here. As coral habitat complexity goes down, you get a decrease in the amount of species. Okay, so if you increase the coral habitat complexity along here from low complexity to high complexity, you get more and more species living there. If you lower the pH of the water, that decreases diversity, and so you get less and less species living there. To summarize those graphs with some pictures, on the left-hand side, you've got the situation as it is now, where there's 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the water. And you can see there some fish, a plate coral, and a variety of large fleshy algae. At 400 ppm CO2, you get much fewer corals, and the algae are smaller. And then at 900 ppm CO2, the whole seabed becomes carpeted in algae, and you don't get any corals at all. Okay, so there's this clear and obvious decline in biodiversity, a loss of key habitat-forming organisms, and unless we adhere to the Paris Agreement, we're going to start to see this around coastlines worldwide.
Okay, so now I'll open the space for Q&A. If you guys have any questions you want to unmute and ask, then you can, or else I'll go to the chat box.
I have a question.
Okay.
So during your work on island of Ischia, so when you were working on that pH gradient in those volcanic vents, so how you first came across those vents, and like how did you first come across that those gradients exist within that particular region?
Well, it's funny. I was on a research expedition on a ship called Urania. It's an Italian ship, and it was a geological expedition, and we were trying to find deep sea coral aggregations. Now, back since ancient times, deep sea corals have been very, very popular amongst the Egyptians and the Romans for jewelry, but no actual studies have been made in the deep sea using cameras and cores and looking at these things properly. So we were on this research expedition around Sicily, off the coast of Italy, and halfway through the expedition, we decided to have some fun and just do some tourism. So the research ship stopped, and we went off in a tiny little inflatable boat to this special place that one of the geologists knew to go snorkeling and have fun. And when we got there, this was the special place. It had this carbon dioxide coming out, like I said, a jacuzzi. And at the time, nobody knew what the gas was. But I thought in my mind that potentially it was carbon dioxide. And if it was carbon dioxide, this would be a good time machine, a way of looking into the future of the planet, because obviously we're increasing CO2 globally. So this was in the back of my mind. And then maybe 3 or 4 years later, I had the opportunity to go back. I just went on my own. I didn't have any money, so I was sleeping on the beach. And I collected carbon dioxide in drinking bottles. I took the carbon dioxide back to the University in Plymouth when I got back from my sort of mini holiday and analyzed the gas, and it was carbon dioxide. So that's when I knew I could apply for research money to try to study these systems formally, because I showed you the pictures. It was a really clear difference from highly diverse marine communities to low diversity as the CO2 increased.
So Liz from the chat says, "Sir, I have read an article about the dance of phytoplanktons from the SDG Academy, and I've been wondering what's the relationship between the rising CO2 levels and phytoplanktons. Can these CO2 emissions cause the wipeout of an entire ocean biodiversity?"
Well, that's several questions, but I'll start with the most important one. Can CO2 emissions cause a wipeout of entire ocean diversity? Absolutely not, I would say, is the answer to that. We've seen in the 6 last big peaks in carbon dioxide in Earth's history that life in the ocean survived. Now, most of the calcified life died, but the engine of life, which is the phytoplankton, survived. And this is a very important fact. So we will not wipe out the diversity of the ocean. But what we are doing is killing giant coral reefs and causing damage through hunting the large tasty organisms. Okay, so these things are definitely happening and happening fast, but we're not going to wipe out life in the oceans. We don't have the power to do that. What was the other question? What's the relationship between CO2 and phytoplankton? Well, CO2 is actually, like I said, a stimulant for the growth of phytoplankton. So in areas where there's enough nutrients in the water, and this is important, then CO2 levels can drive up phytoplankton levels. But there's a phenomenon called growing ocean deserts, which is where in the middle of the oceans, they're running out of nutrients. And the reason they're running out of nutrients is the surface of the ocean is becoming warmer. And with that increased warming, that stops circulation with the cold, nutrient-rich water masses below. And as a result, vast areas of the planet are getting starved of nutrients and therefore more oligotrophic, it's called, and therefore less productive in terms of phytoplankton. Now, you certainly wouldn't notice that if you live on the coastline, because on the coastline of India or the coastline of the UK, we've got increasing amounts of phytoplankton because we're increasing the amounts of nutrients going into the water. And this combination of increased nutrients and increased carbon dioxide is raising the amount of phytoplankton in the water. So it's a bit complicated. It depends where you're talking about. If you're talking about the middle of a mid-ocean gyre, where there's less nutrients, then increased carbon dioxide is having no effect on phytoplankton productivity. In fact, it's causing a lack of nutrients. But on the coastline, it's probably increasing productivity.
All right, before we proceed any further with any more questions, I have an announcement to make. So next month, we have another webinar on paleontology. So stay tuned to our social media for updates on the speaker and the topic of the webinar. The link to our social media is in the chat. So we've given our link tree in the chat. All right, so I think we're done with all the questions in the chat box, and I think most people have had their question answered. So I'd like to thank Professor Jason Hall-Spencer for delivering such a wonderful webinar. And I'd like to thank the core members who made this webinar possible, especially Bandhan, Niharika, etc. And we'd like to have a big round of applause for Professor Spencer. All right, we'd like to bid you farewell, Professor Hall-Spencer, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, sir. Bye, everyone.